Hi, all. Welcome back. We're going to continue talking about human tissues, and we're going to talk about the first tissue type, the epithelial tissue. Okay, so let's dive into it. Epithelial tissue, often it is that tissue that is exposed to the environment, whether that be the internal environment or the external environment. It's this protective tissue sheet of cells that is exposed to the environment. Okay? It could be one cell thick, it could be multiple cells thick, but really a telling component of the epithelial tissue is that there is an apical layer of dead cells or cornified cells. Okay, so it covers the body surfaces, it lines the body cavities, it constitutes most of the glands. So there's lots of glands that are associated, or epithelial tissue is associated with the glands. It doesn't mean that it's the um, entire part of the gland. There might be some muscles associated with that, nerves are associated with that, connective tissue that's associated with that. But it's a big portion of glands. Avascular, so there's not blood flow to it directly. Okay, it's still getting its nutrients, it's getting its nourishment from the underlying connective tissue. So uh, this is where that association between two tissue types is very, very important. All right, so here you might see something like this. This is simple cuboidal epithelium. So cuboidal doesn't mean that they look like cubes necessarily, but it just means that the width and the height are relatively the same. Okay. So you might have on this outer side, which is not really shown here, you might have this apical or some kind of a dead skin layer or epithelium layer. And then you have this basement membrane, which is going to provide this connection between this layer, the epithelium layer, and a connective tissue layer or another kind of tissue. Normally it's connective tissue. Um, just because these cells need to get blood flow and nutrients. Okay, so let's look at the functions. The functions, one of the biggest functions of epithelial tissue is protection. Okay, so it protects the deep tissues from injury, infection. Okay, so this is your outer skin. It's protecting it from UV radiation. It's protecting it from abrasions. It's protecting it from parasites. It's protecting it from bacterial infections, all kinds of things, including injuries, of course. Associated with it are glands. Okay, so sweat glands, hormones, mucus, enzymes, lots of different secretions that are associated with that epidermis. Okay. Excretion avoids waste from the tissues, and so we'll look at some of that. But some of these glands are associated with the, you know, getting rid of waste products. Absorption, it can also absorb things, so it's not completely devoid of being able to absorb material and pass it into maybe the connective tissue. And in some cases, it's the most absorptive structure, okay? And really important for uh, taking nutrients out of like food bolus, or like when you digesting your intestinal tract, the epithelial cells are, that's their job, is to bring in nutrients. Filtration, same thing. It's filtering things that are leaving, filtering things that are coming in. Lots of things. Sensation, a lot of your epithelial tissue has a direct connection with the nervous tissue. Okay, and so they have nerve endings that can detect stimuli, whether that be temperature, touch, okay, all kinds of things that are going on. So let's look at the general structure of epithelial tissue. Okay, one of the key components is epithelial is sheet-like structures typically. Okay, it could be just a single sheet, but the cells are close together. So there's less extracellular material. There's less of that fluid that we were talking about before. That could be protein and water and maybe some carbohydrates and stuff like that. That there's less of that extracellular material. They're avascular. There's no blood vessels. Okay. Again, they're nourished by their connection to the connective tissue. They have a high rate of mitosis, which is what you should expect for something that is being exposed to environments outside of your body or internal environments. Okay, so you have high rates of mitosis or cell replication. Okay, so you can think about your outside layer of skin. Okay, it's just continuously going through mitosis because you get damage. Little bump here, UV radiation there, scrape here. You're just removing that material. And important is to be able to make new cells. Okay? This tissue rate it rests on what we call the basement membrane. Okay, um, or the sometimes called the basal plate or the basal layer. Um, and there's a little bit difference here. The basement membrane is acellular. The basal layer is the last line of cells. Okay, but at any rate, there is a layer between the epithelial layer and the connective tissue layer. Okay, which we call the basement membrane. That basement membrane doesn't have cells, okay, for the most part, and it's just a kind of a cushion between the two layers. Okay, so you often will have lots of protein carbohydrate complexes, which often we call glycoproteins, and you have some anchors that anchor the epithelium to the connective tissue that are going on, collagen fibers, all kinds of things that are occurring, lots of proteins that occur in this region, in this layer. Okay. All right, so that basal surface, again, that's the surface facing the basement membrane, okay? So that's actually, there's a line of cells that have a specific function, which we call the basal surface. The apical surface is the line of cells that is facing away from the basement membrane on that outer surface, okay? So you have the basal surface, which is facing the um, connective or is associated with the connective tissue. And then you have the apical surface, which is on the outside, normally facing the environment. That could be internal environment, but it's also the external environment. Okay. And the lateral surface is all the stuff in between, right? Which sometimes just gets called the sidewall. Okay. Epithelials are classified by the number of cells and sometimes the structure or the shape of the cell. But first off, it's the number of cells layers. Okay, so if it's simple, it's a single layer. So it goes from the apical, then a single layer of lateral, and then the basal surface. Okay. The stratified means you have multiple layers. So you might go from an apical surface, okay, a few cell layers to quite a few cell layers on the lateral surface, and then the basal surface. Okay? So in other words, not all of the cells are in contact with the basement membrane. In this case, they're all in contact with the basement membrane. Okay? So here, just looking at this, so you have simple, Okay, cells. This is the basement membrane. The apical is not really shown here, but you would have a layer of kind of dead material that occurs, or keratinized material that might occur out here. Okay, and then those two are connected. Okay, pseudostratified often are associated with, you have these long, instead of cuboidal cells, normally you have columnar cells, these long cells that are longer than they are wide, and they reach the basement layer and the apical layer, so they're not truly stratified, but they look it, okay, because you'll get these different positions from the nuclei. Okay, they're in different positions along there. And then true stratified is layers of cells on top of each other where they're not actually, these internal cells are not touching the basement or the apical. Okay, cell shapes. Squamose means they're squished. Okay, so squamose cells, they're typically laterally compressed. Okay, cuboidal, again, I talked about this before. The width and the height, they're about the same. Columnar, the width is less than the height of the cell. So simple epithelium means it's a single layer thick. Okay, and then you have those types of cells. So sometimes you'd see simple or simple squamose epithelium. So simple meaning single cells thick, and then squamose being that it's thin or laterally compressed. Okay, simple cuboidal epithelium. Okay, so simple, kind of uniform shaped, so same width, same height cells. Okay, simple columnar, tall, narrow cells. Okay, you get the point. And then, of course, like there are deviations around this. You can have pseudo-stratified columnar, which are technically simple cells, but they look like um, they're stratified. And depending on where this is at, you might have a portion of them that are stratified, so they have cells on top. And then a portion of them that are not stratified and they're simple and they go all the way from the apical all the way to the basement. Okay, but it's it's false stratification. Okay, and that's where it comes in. Not all cells reach the surface, but all reach the basement membrane. Okay, so it's like halfway in between being simple and stratified. Globlet cells, another kind of specialty cell. They're going to be like wine glass shaped, so they come up and then spread out. And normally that's going to be associated with secreting some kind of material. Okay, so if we dive in, we can look at some examples of this. Okay, so lung tissue is a, a really good tissue to look at simple squamosa epithelium. Okay, really thin layer. Okay, that goes along. You want the transfer of oxygen as quick as possible. Not very many layers of cells, because the more layers of cells thick it is, the less transfer you can get. So single row of thin cells permits that diffusion of gases from inside outside across that membrane. Okay. On top of it, you have secretion, okay, of fluids, and lots of different places where this can happen. It's not just the lungs. There's other regions of the body that need that transfer, that rapid diffusion across the membrane to happen. Okay. Let's look at another one. Simple cuboidal epithelium. Okay, so again, fairly uniform shape, length, width, about the same. Okay, the kidney has quite a few regions where this is the case. And again, transfer is quick, and it's only still a single layer thick, but they're not squished down. Okay, so it might take a little bit longer for material to transfer, but it provides maybe a little more protection because the cell's a little more plump and has a little more cytoplasm in it than in the squamosous cells. Okay, liver, thyroid, lots of places where these occur also. Okay, the columnar. Okay, remember we talked about before, cells are associated with being small. And the only way you get large cells is by increasing the surface area. And pulmonary cells are a good example of that. So long columns like you see here, associated with your intestines and regions where you might be absorbing nutrients. And here you can see there's microvilli associated with this, so even more surface area. But these long column cells, single nucleus, but lots of length to them. Okay, and they don't always have to be ciliated, but often when it's associated with nutrient absorption, they're ciliated, or have kind of a microvilli look to them. Okay, and so intestines are a really good example of this. There are these are also included in other regions where, again, there's that absorption, either absorption of fluids, absorption of nutrients, waste being passed across, different things. Uh, lots of places where you might find these cells. Okay. Pseudostratified, again, also can be associated with uh, different regions. Some of the intestinal tract may have pseudostratified. Definitely the respiratory tract will have this, where you might have cilia that are, the job of cilia is to pick up foreign bodies, and put it into mucus, and then that mucus can get rid of the material. So you have an association where you got these column cells, that are reaching the basement membrane, and then you have these goblet cells that occur that are excreting mucus, to help with the process of picking up particles and moving those particles out, so they're not abrasion and damaging the cells themselves. Okay. All right, stratified epithelial. Again, anything over 1 is considered stratified, and so 2 to 20 or more layers thick, cell layers thick, and really it's very similar to simple, except for that middle layer has just a lot more cells. Okay? And they can have any real type of shape to the cells: squamosa, cuboidal, columnar, whatever. And then there are a few unique ones like urethrum, okay, which is part of the urinary tract. And then you can also have some situations where you get both. You can get simple and stratified, and sometimes it's called transitional epithelium, where you get regions that are both simple and stratified. So probably the most rare stratified is columnar. It's pretty rare because the purpose of those columns is to really attach the apical to the base membrane, and make that connection between the two. So rarely do you see columns stacked on top of each other in animal cells. You do see this in things like plant cells quite a bit, but rarely do you see it in the animal cells. Squamosa is probably the most common, most widespread. Okay, and often it's associated with regions where you have new cells being made, and then as they progress, as they move away from where they were being made, as they mature, okay, and move towards dying off, then you start to see them change shape. So they might be cuboidal at first, and then as they migrate, they get squished down, they become squamose, and then they die off, and exfoliation would occur. Okay, so skin cells are a really good example of this. Okay? Your outside skin layer is a good example. Okay, there are two main kinds of stratified squamosa epithelial, one in which keratin is being deposited. Okay, so we call them keratinized. Okay, and so this creates an abrasion resistance. Okay, and then the non-keratinized. And so normally keratinized would occur on the outside layer of skin, help with, preventing abrasions and opening up an individual. And then the non-keratinized would be things that occur inside, and less abrasions are occurring. And so you have less dead cells. So there's just less association with dead cells on the non-keratinized regions. And often it's more associated with like mucus in those regions. So here you can see the keratinized stratified squamosa. Okay, so again, they're squamosa being they're kind of pushed down, they're truncated. Keratinized meaning they're producing keratin, and so they like surfaces that build up calluses, like the bottom of your foot, the palm of your hands, fingertips, are pretty good at building this. So you have these cells that are down by the basement membrane. They're becoming differentiated. So stem cells they're dividing, and making new cells. And as they move up, they're cuboidal typically, although they can be different shapes. And then as they get closer to the surface, they become squamosa, and then they die, and then you get these layers, this thick layer of dead squamosa cells, that typically have lots of keratin in it. Non-keratinized, that outside layer, it's not um, it's not dead cells, although it can be cells that still look apical in a way, and can be scuffing off, but you don't have that keratinized, so you don't have that hard callus that's being formed. Okay, but same thing, you have this basement membrane that's separating the connective tissue from the epithelial tissue. You have these new cells dividing, and as they divide, they grow and often be a certain shape, and then when they get closer to the surface, they squish down, become squamose, and then that kind of builds that surface. Okay, and often, like I said before, they're associated with wet areas or mucus layers, because that mucus is providing the protection, and you don't need a bunch of dead cells that are providing protection for that region. Okay? So instead, you'd have a mucus layer on this outside that provides that barrier between the external environment and the internal environment. Okay? Stratified cuboidal epithelium. Okay? Often these happen in like ducts are either sweat glands or tubules, and so you'll often have kind of, you can tell that there's something that runs through this. You'll have these circles of cells. Cuboidal, again, remember, about the same width as height. Stratified, you can have multiple layers within it. Sometimes, it's looks like they're single, and other times, there might be multiple. But lots of regions of the body that would have that kind of cell. So then you have that specialized cell that's associated with the ureter and the bladder, where you have the urethrum, multiple layers thick. Okay, you have that basement membrane, connective tissue. Um, the other component that you need to think about, because all the nutrients, for the most part, all the nutrients that are feeding these cells are coming from that connective tissue, these cells can only be so thick. Otherwise, the nutrients, you just won't be able to get nutrients out to that outermost surface of cells. So they can only be so thick, and that really limits how thick that epithelium cell can be, or layer can be, from the apical side to the basement membrane.